A little girl grabbed my hand in the pouring rain and asked if I was going to be her new dad. I didn't have an answer for her. I had grease on my fingers, a beat-up van with a bad heater, and nowhere in particular to be, and somehow that was the exact moment everything in my life changed direction. My name is Caleb Merritt, and I have been a mechanic my whole adult life. Not the kind who works inside a climate-controlled shop with a uniform and a waiting room coffee machine. I'm the kind that comes to you, in a van that smells like motor oil and old fast food wrappers, with a toolbox that belonged to my father and a reputation built entirely on showing up when I say I will. I work residential jobs, fleet maintenance for small businesses, breakdown calls when someone finds my number on a laundromat bulletin board. I charge fare, and I do not pad the bill. People in Grover County call me dependable, which is the polite way of saying nobody thinks of me as anything more than what I am when they need me. I had grown used to being useful and then invisible. That was the shape of my life, and I had long since stopped examining whether that was all I wanted it to be. I was 36 years old that October, and I had been alone for a long time. Not the dramatic kind of alone that people write songs about, just the quiet, low-grade kind that settles into the corners of your house and the pauses in your day. I owned a rental bungalow on the edge of town that I shared with nobody, and I ate dinner most nights standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at a table alone felt like a statement I wasn't ready to make. My father had raised me by himself after my mother left when I was 6, and he never once explained where she went or why. I grew up understanding that people who matter sometimes just stop being there, and that lesson had calcified over the years into something that made it hard to let anyone get close enough to matter too much. I told myself I was content. On most nights, I almost believed it. The night I met her, I had been out late finishing a job across the county, a coolant flush for a produce company with trucks going out at 4 in the morning. It was a Tuesday in October, and the rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, that kind of North Carolina October drizzle that doesn't storm, but just soaks everything steadily, making headlights blur, and the road look like it goes on forever. I was heading home on Route 11 when I saw hazard lights blinking through the rain about 200 yards ahead. A car pulled halfway onto the grass shoulder with the hood up. I pulled over before I made a conscious decision to. That is just what I do. I grabbed my flashlight and got out into the rain without thinking too hard about it. I stopped because the lights were on and someone needed help, and that, as it turned out, was the last decision I would ever make completely alone. If you've ever watched this channel before, go ahead and hit subscribe. There are more stories here, and this one is only getting started. The woman standing in the rain next to that car looked like she had been holding herself together by sheer force of will for a long time. She was maybe early 30s, dark hair plastered to her neck, one hand gripping the top of the open hood like it might fly away, the other holding a phone flashlight aimed at an engine she clearly couldn't read. She looked up when I came around, and her face did the thing faces do when a stranger appears in the dark. A half-second of alarm, then the fast calculation about whether to be relieved or more afraid. I held my hands up, flashlight pointing away from her. I told her I was a mechanic, and I just wanted to take a look if she'd let me. She hesitated a moment. Then she stepped back and said, "Okay, please." I told her to stay dry, and she said she wasn't sure that was still possible. I liked that. The way she said it, dry and quick, like dark humor was the only fuel she had left with energy to run on. I got to work. It took me 35 minutes, kneeling in the wet grass with my elbows in the water pooled under the car. The alternator belt had slipped clean off the pulley, which meant nothing was charging, and the car had stalled dead. I had a replacement belt in the van that was close enough to work. When the engine finally turned over, she exhaled like someone who had been holding that breath for an entire week. She thanked me twice fast and said, "What do I owe you?" And I told her nothing, a $6 belt and half an hour of my time. She started to argue, and I said honestly, it wasn't worth either of us standing in the rain long enough to negotiate over $6. She went quiet for a moment, and then said, "All right." And there was a relief in how she said it, like she was tired of having to fight just to receive the smallest kindness. And this time, she simply didn't. I understood that feeling, even then, before I knew a single thing about her life. Then, the back door of the car opened. A little girl climbed out into the rain, barefoot, maybe 5 years old, wearing a pink raincoat over pajamas, and before either of us could say a word, she had crossed the wet grass and grabbed my hand with both of hers, looked straight up at me with the most direct eyes I had ever seen on a child, and said, in a perfectly clear and conversational voice, with not a trace of self-consciousness, "Are you going to be our new dad?" The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had ever stood inside. The woman next to me made a sound I can only describe as a controlled implosion. I looked down at the little girl. She looked back up at me. She was completely serious. Not joking, not performing, not looking for a reaction. She simply wanted to know the answer, the way a 5-year-old asks anything she genuinely needs to know, because the question makes perfect sense to her, and she sees no reason to be embarrassed about it. I had never in my life been less prepared to speak a single word. Diana apologized 14 times in the next 2 minutes. She scooped the little girl up, buckled her back into the car seat over loud protests, then came back to where I was standing, with what I imagine was a thoroughly confused expression on my face. She said her daughter's name was Lily, that Lily said everything she thought out loud without a filter, and that she was truly sorry, and this was not how she had planned to spend a Tuesday night. I said Lily seemed like she knew exactly what she wanted. Diana looked at me a moment with an expression I couldn't decode, and then she laughed, just one surprised breath of a laugh, and it changed her whole face. Then she got in the car and drove away. I stood in the rain until her taillights disappeared, and I thought that was the end of it. I had no idea that by the time the following week was over, I would have eaten at her kitchen table, fixed her furnace, and started to understand that Lily had simply asked the question the rest of us were too cautious to ask ourselves. I ran into Diana Voss again 4 days later at Millbrook Community Health Clinic, where I had been called to look at their backup generator. 2 previous mechanics had checked it and declared it fine. In my experience, that means they looked at it for 20 minutes and did not want to admit they couldn't find the problem. I was crouched behind the generator housing Thursday morning when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there was Diana, in dusty blue scrubs, paper coffee cup in hand, wearing the expression of someone deciding very fast whether to acknowledge me or pretend not to recognize me. She acknowledged me. She said, "Hi, Caleb," like she was checking that the name was right. I told her it was good to see her. She asked if I had found the problem. I said yes. She said the other 2 guys hadn't. I said, "I know." She smiled at that, small and contained. Then she went back down the hall to her shift, and I went back to the generator, and I thought about that smile for longer than I intended to. The generator job took all day. By the time I was packing up in the late afternoon, Diana was finishing her shift. We ended up in the parking lot at the same time. She asked how it had gone. I told her the generator was solid now. She said the clinic had been running on prayers and a fire extinguisher for 2 months, and she was genuinely relieved. Then she paused and asked how I was, the way people ask when they actually mean it, and it surprises them a little. I told her I was fine, which was honest but not complete. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant by that. Then Lily's daycare called because they were closing early, and Diana had to scramble, dialing 3 numbers, her face getting tighter with each unanswered call. I offered to pick Lily up. I know it was not something a person is supposed to say to someone he had met once, in the rain 4 days ago. She looked at me like I had said something a little dangerous. Then she thought for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Okay." Lily ran out of that daycare straight to my van like she had been expecting me, like this was the plan all along, and she climbed into the passenger seat and immediately began telling me about her day in the breathless way 5-year-olds tell you things, where every subject is equally urgent, and the topics jump from a girl named Maya, who took her crayon to a caterpillar on the playground fence, to a careful inquiry about whether I liked macaroni and cheese. I told her I did. She said good, because her mom made the best kind in the world. Then she asked if I was coming to have some. I said that was up to her mom. She considered this a moment and said her mom always made too much anyway. By the time I dropped Lily at the clinic to wait for Diana, she had told me her favorite color was orange, that her dad didn't visit anymore, and that my van smelled like her grandpa's garage, which she said with the confidence of a compliment that needs no further explanation. When Diana came out and saw Lily and me on the bench outside the clinic door, Lily announced immediately that Caleb likes macaroni too. Diana looked at me. I looked at Diana. She said I didn't have to pick Lily up. I said Lily was easy company. Then she said, "Okay, do you want some macaroni?" And that was the first dinner. We ate at a small table in a kitchen with a leaky faucet and a light above the stove that flickered every time the refrigerator ran. Lily ate fast and talked faster. Diana ate slowly and watched her daughter with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, that just sits there quietly doing its work. I fixed the faucet after dinner because I couldn't help it, and it cost nothing. Diana said I didn't need to. I said it was faster than arguing. After Lily was in bed, Diana and I sat on the back porch with coffee, and she told me the outline of herself. 4 years as a nursing aide, moved to Grover County 2 years back, Lily's schedule and her own, a puzzle she solved new every week. I listened and didn't ask more than she offered. Driving home, I noticed the van felt quieter than usual, which was strange because nothing about it had changed. The second time I came for dinner, I brought a box of the exact pasta Diana had used, and she laughed when she saw it and said, "I didn't need to do that." I said, "I wanted to contribute something." Lily declared I was an excellent guest. Diana said the jury was still out, but with a half smile that told me the jury was leaning. That night, after Lily went to bed, Diana and I talked longer. She had been a nursing aide since before Lily, stayed in it because she was good at it, and because caring for frightened people was something she had always understood. She had been married. She said it plainly, the way people state facts they have made peace with. His name was Derek. Separated 2 years. She said it had been necessary in the way some things are that are also not easy, and she said it without anger, which I thought meant the anger had already finished its work. I noticed she checked her phone twice without explaining, and both times her expression tightened a second before she put it face down. I filed it away. Some things you keep quiet about until the time is right. The night she told me about the heater, Lily was in bed and Diana was washing dishes, and said offhand that the heat in the back bedroom had been weak for 2 weeks. She said it like information, not a request. I asked when it started. She said early October. I asked if she'd called the landlord. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I said, "Can I look at it?" She said she wasn't asking me to. I said, "I know. I'm offering." She turned from the sink and looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize, the one where she was deciding whether to let something in or keep it out. She said, "Okay, if you want to." The furnace had a filter so clogged it had killed the airflow to that back room entirely. 20 minutes to fix. When the heat came on in Lily's room, Diana stood in the doorway and listened, and I could see in the set of her shoulders what it meant to her without her saying a word. She said it wasn't nothing. I said it was nothing. We stood in the hallway with the heat moving through the house, and I thought, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that I did not want to leave. That Saturday, I came by without a real reason. Lily opened the door and said, "You're here," with the tone of someone who had been expecting exactly this. Diana was in the kitchen making coffee and looked at me over Lily's head with an expression that was warm and cautious at once. The look of someone holding something carefully because they've dropped things before. Lily pulled me by the hand to show me a drawing she had made. 3 people standing in the rain next to a van, the tallest figure clearly me, with hands the size of dinner plates. She pointed to each and said, "That's you, that's me, that's Mama." I told her it was excellent. She said she knew. Diana came to the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee and said nothing, just handed me one. We drank coffee on the back porch while Lily played in the yard, and for a little while it was the quietest and easiest I had felt in years. That was when I understood that whatever this was, it had already become more than I had planned, and instead of making me take a step back the way things always had before, that realization just settled into my chest like it had always belonged there. Derek first appeared the following week. Diana hadn't said much more about him than his name and the fact that things had ended between them. She had mentioned once that he called sometimes, not really for Lily, more to remind Diana that he still existed. That was her quiet and precise way of describing a kind of cruelty that doesn't leave marks. That Monday evening, I was in her driveway helping swap out the wiper blades when her phone rang and she looked at it and her face changed in the specific way it changes when it has learned to brace for something. She stepped away and answered, and I heard her voice go flat and careful, the voice you use when you are trying not to give anything away to someone who would use it against you. She was on the phone 4 minutes. When she came back, she said, "Sorry." I said, "Nothing to be sorry for." She stood there a moment and said he wants Lily for a weekend and hasn't seen her in 3 months. She changed the subject, and I let her. But I kept thinking about her face when she saw his name on the screen. I met Derek 2 days later. He showed up at Diana's door on a Wednesday evening, unannounced, which I would learn was a pattern and never a spontaneous gesture. I was inside fixing a cabinet hinge when I heard the doorbell, and then his voice. The voice of a man who assumes the space around him is his by right. Diana said, "Derek, I told you to call before you come." He said he was in the neighborhood, and there was an easiness in how he said it that wasn't easy at all. Then he looked past her and saw me in the kitchen, and his expression shifted in the way a rearrangement of ego looks like calm. He said, "Oh, I didn't know you had company." Diana said, "Caleb is fixing the cabinet." He said, "Oh, the handyman." He shook my hand with the kind of grip that isn't warmth. He said, "Nice to meet you," genuinely, the way people say genuinely when they mean the opposite. He stayed 12 minutes. When he left, Diana stood at the closed door and said he'll be a problem. She said it like a forecast she had made before. I said, "I'm not going anywhere." It was just the truest thing I had. Derek had a talent for making himself present in ways that were hard to name as outright wrongdoing. He showed up with small gifts for Lily at the moments Diana was least prepared, always in a way that made him look generous and her look unreasonable. He called at odd hours, nothing threatening, just reminders that he still had a claim. Diana handled it with a steadiness I recognized as the kind built not through courage but through exhaustion. But I watched the cost in the tightness around her eyes at the end of certain evenings, in the way Lily sometimes went quiet after a visit, and Diana would hold her a little longer at bedtime. I stayed and kept my mouth shut because she hadn't asked for my assessment. But I was paying close attention to Derek Voss. I noticed clearly the moment his focus shifted from Diana to me, which happened when she mentioned that I had fixed the furnace back in October. His face went through something in a second and landed on the expression of a man who has just decided something is a problem he needs to solve. I filed it away. I was not afraid of Derek. I was just careful. The end of November came in cold and full. Diana and I had fallen into something that neither of us had named, but that both of us understood was real. She let me in without hesitation now, and I had stopped pretending I needed a reason to come. Lily had invented a name for me on her own, not quite my name, and not quite Dad, but something in between, and she said it with a weight that meant more than a name usually carries. On Thanksgiving, Diana made dinner, and I brought a pie from the gas station bakery because I had forgotten to plan ahead, and she laughed hard enough that she had to put down what she was holding, and that was one of the best sounds I had been near in a long time. After Lily fell asleep on the couch, Diana told me Derek had been asking around town about me, had spoken to the hardware store owner, had mentioned to someone at the dealership that Diana was letting a stranger spend time with Lily. She said, "I think he's going to try something." I said, "Yeah, I think so too." She said, "I'm not asking you to deal with it." I said, "I know." But I had already started paying attention to what deal with it might mean. It started with Wanda, Diana's mother. Wanda loved her daughter genuinely and worried genuinely, and Derek had understood for years that genuine worry in someone who loves you is a door that opens if you push it right. He had been planting things with Wanda for weeks by the time we understood what he was doing. Small comments in phone calls, a suggestion that Diana's hours were irregular, a mention that Lily seemed quieter than usual. Nothing outright false, just arrangements of true things into a picture that wasn't true. Diana had dinner with Wanda in early December and came home unsettled, telling me her mother had repeated things she recognized as Derek's words wearing Wanda's voice. Then, the envelope arrived at Wanda's address from a paralegal at a firm Derek knew. It contained financial records and a letter claiming Diana had unpaid debt and that Lily's home warranted review. Wanda called Diana in tears. Diana called me an hour later, her voice so steady it frightened me, because I knew that the steadier her voice got, the further down she was pushing something that needed to come up. I told her to stay put. When I got to her house, the envelope was on the kitchen table, and Diana was sitting across from it like an opponent she hadn't yet decided how to fight. Lily was at Wanda's. I sat down and read the papers. The financial records used Diana's real account numbers, but emphasized every tight month and ignored every month she had caught up. The dates were inconsistent in ways that told a careful reader the documents had been assembled, not generated. The letter referenced a neighbor Diana didn't know and a doctor she'd never seen. I read it twice. Then I called my cousin Marla, a notary who knows the real from the assembled. I gave her the paralegal's name and the firm. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Caleb, there is no firm by that name in this county, and the paralegal license number does not appear in the state database." I looked at Diana. She looked at me. I said, "Derek fabricated this." She already knew. Having someone else confirm it made it real in a different way, the way a threat becomes less frightening once it has a name and a size you can see. She said, "What do we do?" I said, "We build from what's real." I asked for every bank statement from the past 2 years. She got them. We sat at that kitchen table until almost midnight, and we built the actual picture, the one that showed a woman who had worked double shifts and kept the lights on and paid every bill she could, sometimes late but always paid, and who had raised her daughter well and alone, with no help from the man now claiming she couldn't manage. I called Diana's clinic supervisor the next morning and explained the situation. She offered without hesitation to write a brief statement about Diana's employment record. I also pulled Diana's current lease from county property records, which showed it had been renewed 3 months prior for a full calendar year. You do not renew a lease for a year when you are in financial crisis. By the end of that week, I had a folder. I had a clear idea of what needed to happen next, and I was ready for it. The meeting was Derek's idea, framed as a family conversation about Lily's well-being, and he invited everyone to Wanda's house on a Sunday afternoon. Diana told me she didn't want to go. I said I understood. She said, "But I have to." I said, "Yeah, I know." She asked if I would come. I said I had already planned to. She said Derek is going to use you against me in there, going to make you the proof that she's being reckless and desperate. I said, let him try. I spread out what Marla had found. I showed her the bank statements, the lease, the supervisor's statement. She looked at everything on the table and then at me, and said, "You didn't have to do all of this." I said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" I said, "Because it was true, and it mattered." Those are the only 2 reasons I have ever needed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and she said, "Okay, let's go." There were 8 people in Wanda's living room when we arrived. Wanda, Diana's aunt and uncle from 2 counties away, a neighbor from down the street I suspected Derek had invited for audience purposes, and Derek himself in the chair nearest the center of the room, his folder arranged on the coffee table the way a man arranges things when he wants to arrive already having won. He looked at me when we came in, and his expression did not change. He had expected me and had planned for it. He welcomed everyone, thanked Wanda for hosting, said he just wanted an open conversation about what was best for Lily. He had the skill of men who have spent years making their agendas sound like everyone else's genuine concern. Then he opened the folder and laid out his documents one by one and spoke about financial instability, irregular home environment, his deep concern for Lily. Diana sat beside me with her hands in her lap and her face still. Wanda watched Diana with worried eyes. The neighbor watched Derek and found him credible, which was exactly what he was performing. I waited until he finished. I didn't interrupt, didn't shift or react. I let the room hear him out and waited for the silence to settle. Then I said, as calmly as I could, that I had a few questions about his documents. Derek said, of course, with a patience that was a performance of patience. I asked if the letter was from a licensed paralegal. He said yes. I named the name and license number. He said yes. I took Marla's printout from my jacket and placed it on the table beside his folder. I said that name and that license number do not appear in the North Carolina database of licensed legal professionals, and that firm's name on the letterhead is not registered in Grover County or the 3 adjacent counties. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something real has entered it. Derek said there must be a clerical error. I said possibly. Then I placed Diana's notarized bank statements on the table, 24 months of a woman holding her household together alone. Then the lease copy. Then the supervisor's statement, one at a time. Derek's jaw moved. He looked at the papers, then at the room, then back at the papers. He tried to redirect. He said this was never about paperwork. It was about Lily, and everyone just wanted what was best for Lily. He looked at Wanda, who was no longer looking at him. He said I had no business being there, that I was a stranger with no standing in this family. Diana, who had not spoken once since we walked in, spoke. She said Caleb has more standing in my daughter's life than you have had in 2 years. She did not look away. Derek looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his folder. He said fine, and he said it small, smaller than anything else he had said in that room from the moment we arrived. He walked across Wanda's living room and out the front door. The sound of it closing behind him was one of the better sounds I had heard in my adult life. Wanda apologized to Diana twice, and then a third time, holding her daughter's hands and saying, "I should have trusted you. I should have known better." Diana told her it was okay, that Derek was skilled at making things look like something they weren't, that she had believed similar arrangements of those same true things herself once. Diana's aunt and uncle stayed, and we all had coffee at Wanda's kitchen table, and no one mentioned Derek's name again. And slowly, the room became what it had always been supposed to be, which was family, and the people who belong with them, on a Sunday afternoon. Lily was asleep in her car seat on the drive home. Diana carried her inside, and I stood in the warm kitchen and listened to the furnace running steady, the same one I had fixed in October. And I thought about how a house sounds different when everything in it is working the way it should. Diana came back, and we stood together in the kitchen, and she said he's going to leave us alone now. Not a hope, not a wish. A statement. I said, yeah, I think so too. And then we stood there in the warm, working house, and the silence between us was the right kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. She found me on the back porch that night, after Lily had been asleep for an hour. The cold had settled into everything. I was in the chair that had become mine. She brought coffee and a blanket and sat beside me. We were quiet for a while. The street light made the frost on the grass look like something from a painting. She said, I want to ask you something. I said, okay. She said, Lily asked me last week whether you were going to stay. I didn't say anything. Diana said, I told her I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer at the time. Then she said, but I think I know now. I said, yeah? She said, yeah. She said, I want you to stay, Caleb. I said, I want to stay too. She said, I know you do. I just needed to be the one who said it first, because last time I let someone else decide and it cost me everything. I took her hand, cold from the night air, and she held it and did not let go. And I thought about a little girl in a pink raincoat asking the question the rest of us had been too cautious to ask. Lily had just gotten there first. 10 months later, I can tell you how it came out, though it does not feel like an ending so much as something that settled into being what it always should have been. Lily calls me by a name she invented on a morning in February. Not quite my name and not quite Dad, but something in between, Caleb Dad, announced with the certainty of a 5-year-old who has made up her mind and expects the world to accept it. She climbed up next to me while I was reading the paper, studied me a moment, and announced it. Neither Diana nor I had a single argument against it. Derek filed nothing and challenged nothing, and came to their door exactly once more after that Sunday at Wanda's, said something brief, and has not returned since. Whatever he calculated in that room, the cost of continuing was more than his ego wanted to pay. His loss, in more ways than he will probably ever understand. The clinic made me their permanent on-call maintenance contractor after the generator job, which means steady work and a reason to drive past that building every other week. Diana picked up day shifts there and is home when Lily gets off the school bus 4 days out of 5 now. I have watched what that has done to her face over the months, how the tightness around her eyes has slowly let go as things have been allowed to be merely ordinary and good. Wanda comes for Sunday dinners and never once mentions Derek, and when she passes me in the kitchen, she puts her hand briefly on my shoulder, and that is everything she needs to say about where she stands. Some healing happens in exactly that way, quietly, in a kitchen, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and you only notice it when you step back and realize the hard part has already passed. I drove home that night thinking about the furnace in October, the first dinner, the drawing Lily made with the hands the size of dinner plates, and the way Diana had looked at me on the porch with the frost on the grass and said, I want you to stay. I thought about all the small moments that had turned out not to be small at all, that had turned out to be the whole thing, and I thought that if someone had told me on that rainy Tuesday that this was where I was headed, I would have had no way to believe them. I still don't entirely know how to explain it. What I know is that I stayed, and she stayed, and Lily called me Caleb Dad, and the furnace kept running. And in the months that followed, everything else just quietly fell into place around those 4 things. I don't know how to tell you what the year after that felt like without underselling it. There was no single day that felt like a milestone. There was just a Tuesday when Diana left a key on my workbench without mentioning it, and I understood what that meant without her having to say it. There was a Saturday when Lily sat in the van while I finished a job and fell asleep in the passenger seat, and I carried her inside and put her on the couch, and Diana covered her with the blanket from the back porch, and the three of us were in the same quiet house together, and I thought, this is it. This is the whole of what I wanted and didn't know I was allowed to want. I still think about that sometimes. I think about it more than I'd admit to most people. Lily started school this past fall. She takes the bus home 4 days a week, and on those days, I am usually already there, either working on something around the house or sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, and when she comes up the front walk, she drops her backpack on the porch steps and says, "Hey Caleb, Dad," like it's a complete sentence, which I guess it is. Diana works the day shift now, which means she is usually home an hour after Lily, and those 2 hours in the afternoon are among the quietest and most valuable of my whole week. There is a drawing taped inside the van, the one Lily made early on, with the 3 figures standing in the rain and the hands the size of dinner plates. I never took it down. I don't plan to. I have gotten enough of my life wrong that when I get something exactly right, I like to keep it where I can see it. I called my father the night after Thanksgiving this year, which is not something I used to do, and I told him I had something I wanted to talk to him about. He got quiet in the way he gets when he thinks something difficult is coming. I told him I thought I finally understood some things he had been trying to teach me all those years, about showing up, about staying put, about not letting the fear of being left be the reason you leave first. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Good." He said, "I'm glad." He said, "Come see me." We did. We drove up 3 weeks later, and Diana made him laugh twice before dinner was even ready. And Lily told him at length about the van, and the drawing, and the macaroni, and he sat there at the table with his hands around his coffee cup and a look on his face that I think I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The back porch got a new board this past spring, where the old one had gone soft, and Diana watched me fix it from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee in her hand and said, "When you're done with that, the light above the stove is flickering again." I said, "I know. I saw it." She laughed. Lily asked from the yard if I was fixing the porch, and I said, "Yeah." She said, "Good," and went back to whatever she was doing in the grass, and that was the whole conversation, and it was more than enough. There are days now that are just ordinary. That's the thing nobody tells you about when they talk about how your life changes. It doesn't always change loudly. Sometimes it just settles, quietly, into being exactly what it was supposed to be all along. Before you go, drop a comment below and tell me if you would have stopped on that road. I would genuinely love to know. Some things in this world don't need to be fixed. They just need someone patient enough and willing enough to show up, and then to keep showing up, and to trust that the showing up is enough. I used to think I didn't have much to give a person. I used to think that being good at fixing things that run on fuel and metal was a different kind of good from what a life is made of. I know better now. I know it because of a little girl in a pink raincoat who asked a question in the rain on a Tuesday night and didn't understand at all why it took the adults so long to answer. She just wanted to know. So she asked. That turned out to be the bravest thing anyone did that whole year, and she was 5 years old and barefoot in the rain, and she did it without even thinking about it. That was all I ever had to offer, the willingness to show up. And against every quiet fear I had carried since I was 6 years old, watching the door my mother walked out of, it turned out to be exactly enough.